The letter landed on Hank Miller's dining table with the delicate precision of a grenade. This property is no under the jurisdiction of the Wildest Homeowners Association. Karen Billingsworth stood on the century-old wraparound porch of the Miller Ranch, arms crossed over her crisp white blazer, foot tapping against weathered wood that had survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Behind her, 2 men in polo shirts bearing the Whispering Pines HOA logo shifted uncomfortably. "Your ranch is surrounded by our development now, Mr. Miller," Karen announced, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness of diet soda. "Our board voted last night. You have 30 days to comply with our regulations or face eviction proceedings." Hank Miller, 73 and weathered as his porch, stared at the woman. "Ma'am, this ranch has been in my family since 1903. There was nothing but dirt roads when my grandfather built this house." Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Progress, Mr. Miller. Your rustic aesthetic is impacting property values. The board has specific concerns about your livestock, that weather vane, and..." She gestured vaguely toward his vintage Ford pickup, unauthorized vehicles. As president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, Karen had overseen the transformation of what was once rural countryside into a sprawling suburban development of identical Mediterranean-inspired homes. For 3 years, she'd watched Miller Ranch like a hawk eyeing an injured rabbit, waiting for her moment. Driving back to her pristine home at 42 Lavender Lane, Karen mentally rehearsed her presentation for the emergency HOA meeting that evening. The Miller Ranch annexation would be her legacy. Board members had initially hesitated, but Karen had convinced them of the legal loophole. The original township boundaries had been redrawn, technically placing the ranch within their jurisdiction. "We'll beautify it," she promised. "Replace that eyesore barn with a community center, maybe a dog park. Think of the property values." That evening, as she called the meeting to order in the community clubhouse, Karen felt a surge of power. 20 neighbors watched as she outlined the Miller situation, strategically omitting the ranch's historic status. "Questions?" she asked, expecting none. "Isn't that the ranch that's on the National Historic Registry?" asked new board member Alice Chen. Karen's smile froze. "That's being investigated. Next item." "I checked before coming," Alice continued, showing her phone screen. "It is registered. We can't just seize historically protected property." Karen's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palm. "The registration is outdated. Our legal team is addressing it." This was a lie. There was no legal team, just Karen's brother-in-law, who'd once taken a business law class. As the meeting adjourned, Karen cornered Alice. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but perhaps discuss concerns privately in the future." Alice's expression was genuine confusion. "I thought that's what meetings were for." Karen's jaw tightened. "There's protocol. I've managed this community for 3 years. And it shows," Alice replied with inscrutable politeness. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. Her husband Gary snored peacefully beside her, unaware of her mental calculations. She'd invested too much in this annexation plan to back down. The Miller property was the final piece in her vision for Whispering Pines, her vision, after years of being overlooked at her corporate job, passed over for promotion by men with half her competence. The HOA presidency gave her control she'd never had. Tomorrow, she would escalate. Old Man Miller would learn what happened to people who stood in Karen Billingsworth's way. Karen arrived at the county records office precisely at 8 a.m., armed with a leather portfolio and determination bordering on mania. The sleepy clerk barely looked up as she requested all documentation related to the Miller property. "Historical Society keeps those records now," he mumbled, pointing toward another building. 2 hours and 3 different offices later, Karen discovered something useful, a lapsed permit filing from 1987. It wasn't much, but it was a thread she could pull. By afternoon, Karen had assembled what she considered a legal portfolio against Hank Miller. The HOA charter, highlighted and annotated, a grainy Google Earth printout with hand-drawn boundaries, the permit irregularity, and her secret weapon, Photos of Miller's property documenting 37 alleged violations of HOA standards. This fence height? Violation. Unpainted mailbox? Violation. Livestock within community boundaries? Absolutely not, she muttered, organizing her evidence. That evening, Karen bypassed the HOA board entirely, delivering her ultimatum directly to Hank Miller's door alongside a contractor who specialized in HOA compliance renovations. Your property requires $143,000 in immediate corrections, she announced, handing him an itemized list. As a courtesy, I've brought Mr. Wilkins here to provide an estimate. The HOA is prepared to place a lien on your property if you don't comply within 21 days. Hank's weathered face remained impassive, but Karen noticed his hands trembling slightly, a sign of weakness she intended to exploit. What Karen hadn't anticipated was the crowd gathering at the end of Miller's driveway. Neighbors, her neighbors, watching with concern. We've lived beside Hank for 15 years, called out Brenda Williams from 2 doors down. His ranch was here before any of us. Karen's smile stretched thin. Whole business is for members only, Brenda. Perhaps discuss your concerns at the next meeting. The crowd didn't disperse. Karen felt her control slipping. Later that night, her phone exploded with notifications. Someone had created a Facebook group, Save Historic Miller Ranch. Worse, they dug up county records showing the HOA boundary claim was dubious at best. Most infuriating of all, Alice Chen had posted documentation of the ranch's historical status, complete with protections that superseded local governance. Karen's husband Gary peered over her shoulder. Maybe you should let this one go, Honorable. Absolutely not, Karen snapped. I've invested too much. But if the property is protected, it's about precedent, Karen interrupted. If we let one property ignore standards, what's next? Chaos. The following day, Karen arrived at the Miller Ranch with a cease and desist letter she'd drafted herself. What she found was Hank Miller surrounded by neighbors, her neighbors, helping him repaint his barn, its original historic red. Alice Chen spotted her first. Karen, perfect timing. We're forming a historical preservation committee. The HOA bylaws allow for special interest committees with board approval. Karen's eye twitched. This is unauthorized activity. Actually, Alice continued cheerfully, we took a poll. 87% of homeowners support preserving the ranch as a community landmark. We're thinking seasonal events, maybe educational tours about local history. Karen watched in horror as her carefully cultivated community turned against her vision. Neighbors laughed together, shared lemonade, admired the historic property she deemed an eyesore. Something unfamiliar twisted in Karen's chest, doubt. That night, she sat alone in her pristine kitchen, scrolling through old photos of Whispering Pines before she became HOA president. The community had been new then, struggling to find identity. She'd given them that, structure, standards, consistency. But as she stared at the immaculate streets and identical homes, Karen wondered for the first time if something vital had been lost along the way. The emergency HOA board meeting had been called without Karen's approval, an unprecedented breach of protocol that left her seething as she took her seat at the head of the table. Every chair in the community center was filled, with more residents standing along the walls. The first item, announced Vice President Tom Rodriguez, is the proposed historic preservation overlay for the Miller Ranch property. Karen's objection died in her throat as she realized the entire board had already been briefed, without her. We've consulted with a municipal attorney, Alice Chen explained, displaying documents on the projector screen. The ranch predates our community by nearly a century. Legally, the HOA cannot absorb it without county approval and a historic review. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Furthermore, Alice continued, we've discovered that the ranch contains a natural spring that feeds the community pond, a fact that was omitted from development plans. All eyes turned to Karen. I wasn't aware of the spring, she managed, though she'd known since the initial development plans. The spring had complicated her vision for a unified landscape, so she'd simply excluded it from documentation. The Preservation Committee proposes that instead of forcing Miller Ranch to conform to our standards, we create a mutually beneficial relationship, Alice explained. Mr. Miller has agreed to host seasonal community events and maintain the historic aesthetic of his property, while the HOA will formally recognize the ranch's boundaries and historic exemptions. The proposal passed unanimously, with Karen's abstention noted in the minutes. Afterward, alone in the parking lot, Karen stared at the community she'd shaped through sheer force of will. Perfect homes with perfect lawns under perfect trees. She'd created this, a vision of control and order. And yet, something had been missing all along. The next morning, Karen did something she hadn't done in years. She walked the neighborhood without her violation notepad. Instead of scanning for infractions, she noticed details she'd overlooked. Mrs. Abernathy's award-winning roses, the Patterson kids' elaborate chalk drawings, the way morning light filtered through the old oak by the community pond, that oak she tried twice to have removed for dropping leaves on the walking path. Her feet carried her to Miller Ranch, where Hank was mending a fence. He looked up as she approached, wariness evident in his stance. "Mr. Miller," Karen began, her voice lacking its usual edge, "I owe you an apology." The words felt foreign on her tongue, but strangely liberating. "This ranch," she continued, gesturing to the weathered buildings and rolling pasture, "it has character, something I've been trying to eliminate from Whispering Pines." Hank studied her, then nodded slowly. "Takes all kinds to make a community, Ms. Billingsworth." "Karen," she corrected. "And you're right." She paused, then added, "I understand you have experience with historic woodwork restoration." 7 decades of it, he confirmed. "The community gazebo needs repair. The contractors want to replace it with a modern version, but it's original to the development. Would you consider consulting?" The question hung between them, a tentative bridge over a chasm of mistrust. 3 months later, Karen stood at the podium during the Fall Community Festival, hosted on Miller Ranch grounds. Children played in hay bales while adults toured the historic barn and house. The Preservation Committee, which Karen now co-chaired with Alice, had organized educational displays about local history. "This partnership represents the best of Whispering Pines," Karen told the gathered residents, "honoring our past while building our future." Later, as sunset painted the old ranch in golden light, Karen sat on the porch swing beside Hank, watching their neighbors enjoy the gathering. "You know," Hank said, "my grandfather used to say good fences make good neighbors, but sometimes tearing down fences works better." Karen laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even her. "I'm still not letting the Hendersons paint their shutters neon green." "Baby steps," Hank replied with a wink. As twilight settled over the community, not her community, but their community, Karen realized that the control she'd so desperately sought had never brought her the satisfaction she now felt. In releasing her grip, she'd found something more valuable: belonging. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Karen wondered what other rules might benefit from bending.